Hi everybody and welcome back to another Sponge Chat. I have a very special guest for this Perspectives, Lara Bryfonski, who's a TBLT researcher based in the States. And Lara first got my attention quite some time ago when I was completing the trainer development module for NILE. And one of the assignments actually asked you to create a course for your context. And I wanted to create a course for our academy that looked at, well, basically training teachers in TBLT. And one of the first articles that I read was actually Lara's From Task-Based Training to Task-Based Instruction, Novice Language Teachers' Experiences and Perspectives. I'm going to put a link to it in the blog post because it's phenomenal, yeah? And then I started reading a lot of other stuff written by Lara, and it became very, very aware that well, not only did we share the same passions, but she knows an awful lot about TBLT. So I felt very lucky to be able to have her on today. And so what did we speak about? In other perspectives, we focused on, so for example, with Martin East, I looked at, TBLT in general, and then with Darren Jackson, we went a little bit deeper and we looked at some of the nuances and the perspectives within TBLT. Within this perspective specifically, Lara was kind enough to take us much deeper into the teacher education practices. And so we spoke about some of the projects that she's been involved in, her perspectives on the teacher education side of things, and some of the considerations that teacher educators need to be aware of when we're working with tasks and different types of teachers in different contexts. We also looked at an area which I'm quite passionate about, and that's working with tasks or using task-based language teaching with young learners. It's an area where I feel is very underdeveloped in sort of the research area. There are some really good studies out there, for example, Shintani. But we spoke about some of the difficulties that might come around this and some of the hurdles that we still have to get over. We also spoke about some very interesting projects that Lara has coming up that she's working on at the moment. She's got some very interesting stuff coming out, so make sure you pay attention to that, and I'll try and leave links to everything in the blog post. Looking forward to what you think about this, so please get in touch either by email, on LinkedIn, or on YouTube. I do respond to comments, and enjoy, and we'll speak soon. Well, Lara, thank you very much for being with me. Just to give you a bit of a rundown of Sponge Chats, these started, I don't remember when they started, but they basically started with the question of how I moved into teacher education. And they've kind of snowballed now into, I've done interviews with loads of different people, looking at materials writing, looking at editing, looking at managing within the language teaching industry. And they've kind of evolved into now what I call perspectives, where I speak to sort of subject matter experts on things that they're experts in. And so that's why I've got you on here to talk about something that I'm extremely passionate about, which I know that you are perhaps even more passionate about, which is task-based language teaching. But before we get into, all the task-based goodness, I have a deep question. It's always a very profound question. Who is Lara?
Well, thank you so much for having me on today. Who is Lara is a very deep, profound question, but I will answer it with a very unprofound and normal answer. I hope that's okay with everyone. So I consider myself an applied linguist, and broadly speaking, I research second language learning and teaching. But more specifically, I am interested, as you just mentioned, in specific approaches to language teaching pedagogies like task-based language teaching, how it's implemented in classrooms, and importantly, how to support and train teachers, because I think they're so critical to that process. And on other strands of my research interests, I'm interested in how teachers deliver corrective feedback to their learners, also individual differences in learners themselves and teachers. And also context. So study abroad, for example, I think is a really interesting one to look at. And the interactions with that in TBLT, I think, are really exciting too. But quickly on the non-research side, I'm a teacher myself. I was an EFL and an ESL teacher. I got my teaching license in Boston, Massachusetts, here in the US. And then I worked at a bilingual school in Honduras in Latin America. And that's definitely where my fascination for language teaching and pedagogy really came from. And especially where that classroom-based perspective took hold,
Mm.
because I love to teach still, and I now teach undergrads at Georgetown University, and I'm an assistant professor there in Washington, D.C. So that's all about Lara.
A lot of hats and a lot of things in the space of a minute there. So,
Yes.
well, obviously, I'd like to unpack some of those. I mean, it's so much interesting stuff there to talk about. I suppose we'll talk about the big one, TBLT. Where was the spark? Where did the relationship start with task-based language teaching?
You love an origin story, right?
Yeah, yeah.
uh, Yeah, well, as I mentioned, since I was an EFL and an ESL teacher, so that was first with high school age newcomers, so recent immigrants to the Boston area, and then
Mm,
elementary age EFL students in a bilingual school in Honduras. So I would say as a language teacher, I was always really curious about what teaching methods were most effective. Also, which ones were just practical? What could I actually implement? What seemed
mm,
useful in my classrooms? And for my students. And so I always really liked experimenting with different approaches and techniques. I was an undergraduate linguistics major, so I had this natural curiosity for the language side of things. And now I realize as a researcher that back then I was really engaging in a little bit of action research. So I was kind of in the process of manipulating different strategies without a real research lens, but to see what was working. So I didn't know that at the time. And I wasn't introduced to TBLT specifically as an approach until I was in graduate school. But it immediately struck me that it aligned with my beliefs and my experiences for effective language teaching. So
mm.
I was kind of instantly hungry to learn more.
Yeah.
And I feel really lucky that I was able to pursue that kind of to the, the greatest conclusion, which is taking it back into classrooms and really seeing how I can dedicate a full-time research agenda as a professor to looking into it. So an academic and a practical origin story, I would say.
Yes. Very interesting that you mentioned that it aligned with your beliefs. Which today we're going to speak about, the teacher education side of task-based language teaching. Um, and it's interesting because I think I look at my not only my perspective as a teacher, but also working with other teachers. I think a lot of teachers mm, they agree with a lot of the things. Perhaps there's a sort of a disconnect with their ability to implement it, or perhaps the way they do implement things. And I'm looking forward to delving into that a little bit further. Just on a side
Definitely.
note, though, how did you get into research? In fact, this is one of the jobs within the linguistics and language teaching community that I haven't actually spoken about. How and why did you move into research?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Well, like as I said, I wasn't a linguistics from coming from a linguistics perspective originally.
Mm,
So I did my undergrad at Boston University, which has a very strong, more theoretical approach to linguistics. And so I think that that paired with the teaching experience, that combination kind of made me question. I had all these hypotheses about why, after lots of instances of feedback, my students were still making the same errors. And I just really wanted to get to the answer of those questions. And I knew from that background in linguistics that there were ways to go about answering those questions with empirical research. So I kind of just, the longer I taught, the more hungry I kind of grew for answers. And I
mm.
knew that I wasn't able to really do that as a full-time elementary school teacher, because obviously you've got really pressing matters to attend to,
Yep.
especially with second graders, which is who I was teaching at that time. So, we're just keeping everybody safe at that point. And, hoping we get some language learning and fun along the way and content learning. So I knew that research was really the only way that I'd really be able to explore that curiosity. And luckily I got a really great background in research methods from Allison Mackey at Georgetown and Lourdes Ortega and all of
Wow.
my now colleagues. So, I who better to learn the ins and outs of doing research from?
Very, very spoiled. I'll say
I
that.
am spoiled. Yes, I am very spoiled.
Okay, that's very interesting. I think it's something that I'd like to look at in the future, especially within the field of task-based language teaching. I think here, like I'm in Spain, in the north of Spain, and just in Barcelona, they have like the University of Barcelona, they have a very big task-based language teaching, like with Roger
Yeah.
Gilbert, and there's a very large crew there. So maybe one day I will venture over into that
Yes.
world.
Yes, I'm sure they
Um,
would welcome you in.
but so back to TBLT. Um, why is TBLT something that teachers, uh, no matter what context they're sort of teaching languages in, should be aware of or should be thinking about? What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, so going back to that research connection, I think something that really got me hooked initially at TBLT was not only obviously that I had that initial correspondence with my own kind of impressions about what was effective in my own classrooms, and I'm aware that that doesn't work from everybody, and we'll talk about that later.
Mm,
But the connection to the research and how languages are learned and taught. So the fact that TBLT is founded and very much aligns with those best practices, and also just general theories of education, which I had known about before I learned about TBLT, like Deweyan, student-centered learning, the theories of interaction, supporting language acquisition from researchers like Mike Long and Sue Gass and
mm,
Allison Mackey, and the fact that it helps learners associate an authentic meaning with their real needs for their language skills rather than learning these deconstructed pieces of grammar. Like I, for example, learned French in high school
yeah.
and mostly through these grammatical exercises and drills. And I knew that that wasn't effective because I lived in Paris for a while and I barely could order food in a restaurant. So I knew that that was not the way that I was aligned with my learning. And I knew that from teaching in a bilingual context where it's a very immersive experience, I knew that this drive to find meaning through needs analysis and aligning with the kids' needs was
Mm.
just seemed really beneficial and not a way that I had been taught how to teach, really. And I'm not saying that research has all the answers or that there's one single best approach, but TBLT, I think, aligns with what many researchers have found to facilitate acquisition, like
Mm.
negotiating for meaning. So that struggle to be understood by whomever you're talking to and modifying what you're saying based on the feedback that you hear, these these kinds of things really don't follow easily from a grammar-based instructive style to
Yeah.
really emphasize this struggle to be understood and what we can learn from that negotiation for meaning process. So I think the fact that those things really seem to align with TBLT is what teachers should realize because, if we're all looking for strategies that can be, based in more generalizable principles for how most people teach, I think a lot of times teachers, they want to know what specifically for their context and their language and their school. And there's a lot
Yeah.
of reason to believe that that's a good way to go. And you should contextualize. However, it's also good to step back and see, okay, what is generalizable across language learning as a process? Is there anything that we can get that is a generalizable understanding? And I think that there's a lot of positives to a TBLT approach that align with that.
Yeah. Obviously completely agree with everything that you just said. um, it's interesting because I think, at least in my experience within Europe, so I've only really taught within Europe. Um, and I mean, even when you look at the coursebook industry, it's still very synthetic based in terms of the syllabus
Mm-hmm.
um, and even when I often observe a lot of teachers, and um, there seems to be a misconception, between sometimes what TBLT is, looking at the ideas of it's just no grammar, or there are some misconceptions there that have kind of proliferated, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
So I suppose when we come back to this idea of teacher education, bringing TBLT to teachers, and I know that your paper looked at, in fact, I've got it here somewhere. I've got it here. So it's got loads
Ooh.
of notes over it. Um, it looked at the idea of implementing teacher education courses, or looked at the studies around that, and looked at the effectiveness of sort of training with teachers. But I suppose my question is, how do we bring TBLT to teachers in a way that they find relevant, that they find it's easy enough to take away and use, practical in a sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that that's so critical, and that's why I'm so interested in teacher training as a facet of TBLT to do research on, because I think that many people would agree with this, that if we don't successfully train teachers and have teachers buy-in and belief that it's going to be a successful approach, then there's really not very much point in studying at all, because they're the ones that are bringing it to the classroom and to the learners ultimately. So I do think that my study in particular showed that an approach that takes a look at the individual differences in the teachers is one that could be very useful. So looking at what kinds of experiences do you have? I mean, there's a lot of interesting research and education about the effects of lots of prior teaching experience, this apprenticeship of observation that we all have from being students are a majority of our lives before we enter into the fields that we work in, especially teachers, because they go to school for education where they're also in classrooms, and they just have a life completely in classrooms. They're learning from what they saw, what they experienced. And so depending on if your beliefs do or do not align with it, if your experience learning a language does or does not align with TBLT, this could really affect how you see a training program that's being implemented to help to support you in adopting this type of approach. So I think any teacher trainer needs to consider those individual characteristics. What is the background? Are your teachers native speakers of the language, or are they L2 learners or heritage learners themselves? That's going to affect the lens that they see the training through, their experience teaching, their experience learning languages. So I think just even a basic survey, a needs analysis, modeling that approach through your teacher training program. So really practicing what we preach here is the way to go. And that can help you, I think, pitch your training to what teachers are really concerned about. Are they worried about lack of resources? Well, I would say TBLT is actually a really great approach for a low resource school, because you're not relying on expensive, textbooks that are really about, often making lots of money and not necessarily about the exact language acquisition principles that are in those pages. So I think that there's ways that you can address people's concerns and help them see how this could be really effective for their context.
Yeah, definitely. I'm going to play devil's advocate here just for the fun of it.
Sure. Yeah.
So, people say, well, the classroom is not only about language acquisition.
Mm-hmm.
And so course books, in a sense, they provide a lot of other things. There's exams, there's all sorts of stuff. So a teacher says that to you. What's your immediate reaction?
Well, exams to me, I mean, it really depends, again, what's your context. So if we're operating within a state mandated or a country mandated curriculum where there's high stakes assessments, there's not a lot that you can do. I mean, you have to give the students the mandatory assessments. However, you can look to see how you can tweak your curriculum so that it both can be approached from a meaningful, needs-driven perspective and also support learners when they go to take these types of assessments. And I also think that, the day-to-day of designing assessments for your own class should really be bespoke and needs driven anyway. You shouldn't be assessing your students on things that weren't taught. And you should be looking to see if they can do things with the skills they learned in your class. So I really think that it doesn't say that a task-based approach couldn't also be effective. And in fact, I think that the idea of thinking about your students' needs helps you drive this idea of why are we doing this, especially in places like a lot of places around the world where we have, students who are mostly studying, for example, English as a foreign language, just so that they can pass these giant state mandated assessments. So TBLT can really help you look for the why. Like, is there anything else that your students are getting besides just passing this test? Are they engaging in social media? Are they on TikTok watching videos? Are they engaged with global politics? I mean, it helps you drive the rationale so they can learn, I think, more effectively.
Brilliant. Yes. To go one step further with that, within the TBL literature, you have like Long and Jeff Jordan, and there's a strong form, uppercase TBLT, and then you have lowercase TBLT or a task supported syllabus. I spoke to Daniel Jackson, I've spoken to Martin East, and I'm eventually going to speak to Jeff Jordan once I finish reading his book. What's your perspective on, if there's a spectrum there on the strength of TBLT, from uppercase to lowercase? Is it do you see it as okay to implement a task-supported syllabus, or should we be aiming for that pure uppercase TBLT?
Well, you might not like my answer because I don't think that I'm going to come down super strongly on one side, and I don't think that it's necessarily a good thing to box yourself into one approach. Um, from a researcher space perspective, I would say has to be a strong form. I mean, this was born out of the need
Yeah.
to have a focus on forms approach that fills in a lot of these gaps that we see in other approaches to language teaching, where especially adult learners become very stagnant in this focus on very explicit learning. And then also they can't totally focus on implicit learning anymore if they've, cognitively developed past those abilities. So this is a very, the rationale originally for it from Mike Long's perspective was really driven in the science of language acquisition. So
Mm.
it's hard to say, oh yeah, that's impossible, you shouldn't do it, if that's really what the research and the science is telling us. So, from a research-based perspective, I think that you really should support the strong approach. Now, of course, the task-supported approaches, the lowercase TBLT, is born out of issues that teachers face, and I
Mm.
think it's obviously important to take those issues into consideration, and we should not ignore what teachers are saying. And like we spoke on earlier, they are the implementers of
Yeah.
the real classroom activities, so we need to have their buy-in. So I think that's, making concessions or changing things to make sure that it is applicable to specific context, to the real lived experiences of learners and teachers is also really important. And for that reason, there may be things that can't be done that would follow that specific strong approach.
Yeah.
So I don't necessarily think that it's useful. I mean, it's useful to think about, theoretical concepts in different spectrums, obviously, but I don't think that it's useful to say absolutely never on any camp
Yeah.
because it's just not the reality, right? And that's why it's fun to kind of learn about these different areas.
Yeah, yeah. I agree. I remember, in fact, I've got it here. I remember reading Long's book here.
Yeah,
You can see that it's got
look
many
at
notes in it.
that. Yeah.
And I was like, oh yes, I would love to implement all of this. And I agree with, a lot of things that he says. There are a few things I disagree with, but I agree with a lot of things that he says. But then I also see the realities of different contexts around the world, even from the people that I've spoken with. And it's I see I think I said this to Martin East and even to Daniel. I said that I view the task supported syllabus as the foot in the door to getting TBLT with teachers. I think that's
Hmm.
probably the first step that needs to be taken before we start seeing full blown uppercase TBLT programs widely disseminated around the world, if you will, or widely operating. But going back to the implementation of
Hmm.
of task-based language teaching within language teaching organizations around the world, looking at the teacher aspect, as a trainer, as a teacher educator working with teachers, and we're going to talk about observations in a sec, but perhaps some of the elements of TBLT that teachers might find uh, not difficult to grasp, but difficult to implement specifically. And perhaps I'm referring to like the principles here, like focus on form and
Mm.
negative feedback. In your experience, what are some of the elements that teachers need most support with or most guidance with?
Hmm. That's a great question, and that's kind of an active area of investigation that I like to do research on. I like to see what happens when you ask a teacher, you give them a training, and then you say, "Okay, design a task." What happens?
Mm.
And there has been quite a few studies. Rosemary Erlum has a fabulous study. The I still don't know what a task is in the title. And I have some of my own research in my context in Honduras, where we see that, despite training, you still have a lot of variability in how people approach task design processes. And it seems like this is influenced a bit by the perspective the teachers are coming from, their individual
Mm.
differences, and how they view the training, which is why I say that my main takeaway is often that we need to really look into those teacher individual differences to understand
Yeah.
how we can adjust and get them to where they need to go. So that's the design side. So there's
Mm.
always sometimes, you know, you've got people that really run with it and people that are still needing support in certain aspects of task design. And then when it comes to implementation, the study that I published in 2021 in LTR, I thought one of the really interesting findings when I looked at their implementations against, you know, Mike's 10 methodological principles of TBLT, which I used to kind of frame what I was observing. They were, and these were novices, by the way. These were very
Mm.
new teachers with very few years of experience for the majority of them. And that they really, you know, they were struggling with more reactive aspects, which makes sense. So
Mm.
corrective feedback, you know, these moment-to-moment decisions where you're trying to make sure that you're aligning with where your students are and their developmental linguistic, you know, knowledge, aligning with the feedback they need in the moment to complete a task that they're doing. These elements were very difficult for them because they were
Yeah.
so focused on just doing their lesson as they designed it. So a lot of times they could take a task to the classroom and say, here we go. But when things went awry, they struggled more to adapt and
Yeah.
re-articulate what was happening in the classroom. And they were very much focused after that on just keeping the classroom collaborative environment going,
Going,
which
right?
makes
Yeah.
sense. Yeah. So that was their main focus. And those other smaller, more discrete aspects of TBLT approach were not as visible in their lessons. So, and I think that that speaks to their development as teachers. And so that can kind of chart, I think, a very nice program that you might, if you had all the time and money and with people to do, to help them move past reactions to immediate needs to, you know, thinking more about the holistic language learning of your
Yeah.
students and when we can deviate from our plan and when we should stick to it.
Yeah, it's very interesting. You know, I can hear some teacher educators thinking, "Oh, that's why task-based language teaching is not for early career teachers." But you know, from my experience, I think this is being an early career teacher. You,
Yeah.
no matter what methodology that you're implementing, you're generally focusing on sort of the classroom dynamics and just maintaining control. And I suppose my encouragement, if you will, to teacher educators out there and even pre-service course providers is that we need to provide these opportunities for those teachers to develop the relevant schemata and experiences within the classroom so that they can start to implement effectively, you know, focus on form or reactive negative feedback and things like that. So yes, but I think we're fighting against the grain there a little bit, but that's just my my thoughts. Um,
Yeah.
Going back to sort of the observation element. Now
Hmm.
you in fact we were speaking by email about this quite some time ago
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
the sort of the observation scheme that you developed.
Hmm.
Um, could you talk us very briefly through that? Because I know that there are many teacher educators out there, even from a if we think from a language teaching organization management perspective, looking at quality
Mm.
assurance and things like that,
Mm-hmm.
observations form a very important part in not only quality assurance but also language teacher development. And so, if teachers are looking to do task-based language teaching lessons, or if there's going to be a task-based teaching course, there should become some kind of observation, feedback, co-construction around that. And I thought that your observation scheme was very, very interesting. So, would you be able to explain very briefly, you know, how it worked? I know there's a lot of intricate details in there, but very briefly, how it worked and what your thoughts are about it are now.
Yeah, well, I think it's important to say, you know, caveat here that that observation scheme was for my dissertation, which was a, you know, giant, very detailed project. So I wouldn't say that I necessarily would recommend that your average teacher or teacher educator would just take this scheme that I used and implement it for observations because that wasn't really the design or the intention
Mm,
of it. I was more coming at it from a purely research
right.
lens at that time, and wanted to see what was happening and could I align it with Mike Long's 10 principles and to what
Mm,
extent could we really see these and how would we operationalize these constructs in an observation form. So I came up with operationalizations for each one of them, and I basically looked just to see if people were working in line with that methodological principle, if it was just not observable or absent. And again, I was looking just at short, instances of one aspects of teaching. Observations are always a snapshot. Usually an observer's paradox is going on and people are really on when they're being observed. So it might not even be reflective of their day-to-day teaching. So, there's so many caveats there. And then I also looked to see if, they were kind of working kind of not opposing, but because that sounds like they were doing it for an explicit reason, but just maybe they were working kind of counter to that principle, just maybe by focusing on forms, for example, like doing a grammar-based exercise as their main activity rather than, implementing a task. And I found that did happen, is that in the moment, teachers were, they tried to do something and then they saw that there was a lack of language. And then they pivoted immediately to their intuition from wherever they got their prior experience, which was not present in the training at all, and implemented, I have to do this, they're not getting it, they have to learn the grammar and we need to drill that in, and then maybe we can do something fun. So we had to have many conversations about how that was really working counter to what we were trying to accomplish with our tasks. So the observation rubric was highly detailed. I think that if I was to make a recommendation for somebody who was interested in using the MPs, the methodological principles, would be to look at just a couple of them in one setting. Because 10, there's so much going on. It's very difficult. I had multiple like research assistant coders that helped me looking at all these different aspects. We had a 360-degree camera that we used. It was really involved. It's just not something the average, I think, person would do. But the one thing that I would recommend is the idea of using stimulated recall interviews afterwards. So I was a teacher, I went to ed school and I was observed, but I never had a stimulated recall done. I did record myself teaching, but I do think that this is a place where education can really borrow more from, maybe applied linguistics. Usually it's the reverse, right? And having the teachers immediately sit down afterwards and just asking them that open-ended question, what were you thinking? What were you thinking then? What were you thinking then? Or even letting them say what they were thinking if they could remember, and getting just a sense of where their minds were at when they were having these interactions with students, when they were making those decisions to pivot to a grammar exercise. That was fascinating, I think, for me as a researcher, but a lot of them told me afterwards that they learned a lot from the experience also. So I think it was a useful learning tool as well as a research instrument.
Yeah, it's very interesting that you mentioned that because as I mentioned in our email, I've just I'm actually reading. I'm almost in the last sort of unit at the moment, chapter, Daniel Jackson's book on teacher noticing,
Yes.
with the language tasks. It's fascinating. There's a lot to unpack in it, but it obviously uses this idea of not stimulated reading, but they're using elements of that, so that teachers look at the video of them teaching or through a task, and then they say what they notice of themselves and of the learners that they're working with. But I think it's one of those tools that has still to creep in to the world of at least language teacher education. Bringing in there and actually doing it with teachers, because it does take time. And the traditional sort of observation model, which is I'm not going to say anything further than that because we'll get into a rant. But the traditional observation model is, that you come in and you think the observer is going to sort of just top down. This is the good things, these are the things you need to improve, which I disagree with. So we need to rechange that. And I think the stimulated recall is actually a brilliant idea of bringing that in. You don't even need the video. Do you know what I mean? You don't even need to use video for that. But yes, very, very interesting. I'm gonna quote you here.
Okay. Oh gosh.
Okay. All right. So Bryfonski, page 17. Okay. No, here we go. Right. So the findings support the ability of a short-term training program to impact on teachers' implementation of TBLT principles.
Yeah.
You remember writing that, I suppose.
I suppose.
Okay. So from your findings then, training, whether it's a short-term course like this, or I'm assuming if it's longer, over in-service courses as well, it can have, I'm not gonna say it does it, so it can have a positive impact on teachers' implementation of TBLT, right?
Yes, it can for sure. And I said short term very particularly because it's my experience from working with an NGO in Latin America that is partnering with schools and knowing the NGO world and the international kind of bilingual education space in a lot of places is that they don't have a lot of time.
Mm,
They are getting teachers, either local teachers that speak English usually to staff their schools, or they have international volunteers, or whatever their situation is. They usually have a very limited amount of time to bring people up to speed on the curriculums that they use and the approach that they want them to do. So I think that while I definitely would recommend and prefer a longer period of instruction and intervention with teachers, I think it's interesting and important to look at the reality, which is that a lot of these programs have like a couple months to train their teachers before they start
mm.
the school year.
Yes, unfortunately, that's a big problem, right? Is having actual time with teachers. And I mean, I suppose I'm very lucky in my context. Compared to other contexts, we have quite a lot of financial resources to implement
Mm-hmm.
training. We have quite flexible timetables and things like that. So, very lucky where I am. But I know that in some contexts, it's definitely not the case. And if teachers are looking to implement TBLT, and teacher education is needed there, and so that
Mm-hmm.
that could be quite a big hurdle to jump over, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Um, uh, Speaking about other hurdles within TBLT,
Yes.
so I have a few things I'd like to throw out there. The
Great.
first one, young learners. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like a dirty word in the task-based language teaching literature because it's not there. There's not a lot on, I give my huge kudos to Shintani and all of her amazing research that she's
Yes.
done there.
Yes.
And there are a few other researchers that have looked into that area, but in general, I mean, even if you look through Long and a lot of his stuff, there's not a lot that focuses on young learners. And I'm one of the
Mm-hmm.
people that's over here saying, do task-based language teaching with young learners. You know, so from your experience, and obviously you've worked in a young learner context,
Mm-hmm.
um, is TBLT applicable for young learners?
I think 100%. So I think that it does require us to uh, kind of envision tasks from a slightly different perspective. So there is kind of almost like a CLIL TBLT hybrid, I think, going on in a lot of those environments, where it gets, the definitions start to get a little bit blended and messy.
Mm,
And there have been a variety of people that have looked into how these can be combined, and I think that they can be combined profitably, because the reality is that little kids in school, in bilingual schools or language environments where they're learning other languages, they're doing tasks that align with this concept of being a kid in school, right? So it's very different from Mike Long's tasks in his book, which are like reading a label on a medical
yes.
um, on your prescriptions or something like that, which are really socially important and necessary things that immigrants and people around the world are facing, and we need approaches that fit them too. But I would argue that things that kids are doing in school can be seen as tasks too. So they're playing
Yes.
games, they're having interactions with friends, they are doing sports, they're singing songs, they are, any elementary school teacher will tell you the number of things that could be considered tasks in an elementary school classroom. They're just slightly different, and they aren't the ones that are more commonly written about. And so when I teach or when I train elementary school teachers and I tell them about TBLT, I say, okay, you might be doing, reading or literacy, but think about how are you designing your tasks, your classroom implementation to be facilitative of language learning from this perspective that I'm telling you about. So yeah, you can do learning from a very like drill based perspective where we're like, these are long A's, these are short A's, and
Mm,
we're going to just sort the pictures or something. And you can also take that and say, how can I make it interactive? How can I make there be a gap? How can I impart on learners that they need to negotiate and use whatever language that they have to do it and support
yeah.
them in that? So you can take these ideas from TBLT and make sure that they're integrated into your more content based if you want to think about it as a content full classroom with children. And really, then that is the task. So I just think you need to kind of be more flexible. And it's hard when a lot of the research and a lot of the stories that we see about TBLT are with adults doing really real world things. For real world for kids is, how do I resolve a conflict with my friend who I stole their pencil from, or something like that. Like a
Yeah,
great teacher.
yeah. I mean, definitely. I mean, you mentioned this idea that there are lots of tasks that kids do that are brilliant for, they need to do them, and to involve them in a language learning context, I think is excellent. We're looking to implement a task supported syllabus in our academy next year, and it's based
Oh,
off this
cool.
idea. It's still a lot of work to go, so I'll let you know how it goes. But
Yes.
but you mentioned also something that I find is very, very interesting, and it's heavily stigmatized still, and it's just the idea of the use of L1 in the classroom. Um, you know,
Mm.
teachers kind of have this misconception, there's no L1, don't use it, it's a dirty word. And it's very interesting because I've presented over the last year or so a few times at conferences speaking about using tasks with young learners. And I spoke about Shintani's study and how she, repeated the same task multiple times, slight variations, but how the level of teachers L1 and learners L2 sort of changed over the
Mm-hmm.
course of those 9 tasks. And I think that's one of the really important things that we should be stressing with teachers, that the L1 shouldn't be stigmatized. It's there as a tool. And I think perhaps the other important thing there is, if we're thinking about, the idea of the research behind what happens with young learners is, they're there to be listening, really.
Mm-hmm.
There needs to be a lot of input there. So yes, very interesting points there.
Yeah.
And that is, hopefully this is a hurdle we get over. I do hope that there are more example syllabi that come
Mm.
out of people running at least task supported syllabi with young learners in the future. Who knows? Maybe I'll have something like that in the future.
That would be wonderful. Yeah, and I
But
would love to see more task repetition studies with young learners because, like you say, it's the repetition is a really common way that kids learn. In monolingual settings too. They're singing the same songs. They have their morning meeting and they sing the alphabet. They talk about the weather. They have these repeated patterns that help
yeah,
structure the day, help structure behavior, and also help structure what they're learning and what they acquire. And that same process happens with language learning in these types of contexts. So that task repetition, seeing what learners glean from it, and of course I encourage the teachers in my training programs in the bilingual school that I have worked with. We're not stigmatizing, in this case, Spanish ever.
mm,
We should actually have conversations with our students about how amazing it is that they're bilingual and they're speaking
yes,
multiple languages and what that offers. And you
yeah,
would never say, no, don't speak Spanish in this classroom. Never. You can encourage English if you're trying to get them to, if you're trying to push output, you can encourage English, but you never stigmatize the L1 because you're
yeah,
right, it is a resource. The input side of it on the teacher side, that changes depending on your context, right? In
of
an
course,
EFL
yeah.
setting, it's if you're going to spend the whole day speaking their native language, they're not getting any input.
Oh
They're
yes,
probably not
that's
going to
yeah.
learn. But in ESL settings here in the US, for example, it's a totally different situation, right? Because people
Right.
are surrounded by English, and really the issues that students are facing are that they're losing content, they're losing their ability because they don't have any support in their native language. And so here in the US in the ESL environment, it's a totally different conversation about a teacher using the student's native
Yep.
language if they are able to.
Yeah, yeah. Um, couldn't agree more. Uh, and interesting that this idea of production. Um, One of the biggest things that I actually came against when I was trying to, work with teachers on using tasks with young learners was this idea that they're trying to force production from learners that are even like at a pre A1 stage, if we're looking at the
Mm,
Common European Framework, right?
yeah.
Um, when in reality that's not really needed at that stage, right?
Mm-hmm.
But so I think that's another things that we kind of need to work against with looking at the teacher education side and bridging this research gap which I think is one of, as teacher educators, that's one of our roles,
Yes.
um, and I think it's a very important role, especially considering task-based language teaching is heavily research based, right? so
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
so it's bridging that and making it kind of digestible for teachers. Um, but one other hurdle I want to just throw at you before we move on to sort of the advice and book recommendations.
Yeah.
TBLT has kind of been implemented in some countries almost like overnight.
Mm-hmm.
And uh, one thing that hasn't changed are kind of assessment practices. You're probably seeing where I'm going with this.
Yes.
Um, so how if TBLT is to work, and if we're to make it work in certain contexts, what needs to change in we've spoken about the teaching element, but what about the assessment element? How does that tie into task-based language teaching and language learning goals?
Mm. Well, I mean, obviously there's so many levels to that question, right? You have like larger education policy issues that are at play, which are involved in, politics and advocating for talking to teachers and educators when we make these policy decisions rather than just implementing them from, far off
Mm,
lofty places like in governments. So, obviously there's like an advocacy issue there. And then from more of like a local perspective, I think I mentioned this before. I really think that my only offering is that in cases where there's no choice, when the tests are there and they're going to be always there and we have to take them, um, that TBLT can really help empower programs and teachers to find meaning in the meaningless, um, empowering students to examine their own future or their current needs or what they actually might be able to do if they could access other languages, empowering them to search for those needs, and empowering them to find purpose. And we know that that can help with motivation, which is, very tied to language acquisition. So the connections there, I think, are what would really speak to teachers, right? So imagine you can increase the motivation of your learners through this process of looking through at their needs in a holistic way, even when it seems like all they need is to pass this test.
yeah,
How can we prepare them to pass that test, which they have to do, while also helping them find a meaningful goal for their
yeah.
language learning and then work on that in the classrooms? And I think that that idea of looking at it through a motivation lens, is one that has been useful in my experience.
Yeah, completely agree. I would love for the people implementing the laws on assessment, to actually have an understanding of, how it ties in. Because a lot of these contexts where, for example, I know that in Japan, task-based language teaching has become very, very popular. But when it was first implemented, task-based language teaching was the teaching pedagogy, but the assessment hadn't changed
Yeah,
from
yeah,
the previous model. And obviously teachers were like, well, why am I going to
right.
use that?
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, I think there needs to be sort of a very specific approach by everyone involved. And teachers, even in places where they can't change the
Mhm.
assessment sort of, from the top area, I think they can make a lot of efforts with task-based language teaching in the local contexts. Um, very briefly, I just wanted to pick your brain before we move on to the last part.
Yeah.
You have a work in progress. I've been doing some of my own research on Lara,
Oh,
designing an online task-based teacher training course, a collaboration between researchers, teachers, and administrators.
yes.
Okay, I know this is like not finished; it's not out there. Um, can you give me some goss?
Yeah,
How?
definitely.
Yeah, tell me a little bit about it.
I love to goss about the research. Yeah, so I just presented on this project with my collaborators, which were an administrator, a teacher, and a teacher trainer, all in the Latin American context where my study took place. So it's the same context that you read about in my 2021 paper. That is my dissertation research. And so there was a colloquium at AAAL this year that was organized by Andrea Revesh and Eugene Kim. And we all were talking about how we can foster this collaboration between all the stakeholders that are important to TBLT implementation. So I think that it's really speaking to this buy-in that you're advocating for as well, of bridging the gap between research and practice, and also importantly, I think, practice and research. So we need to learn from them, just like I
Yes.
mean, this is not a one-way street, is what I'm saying. We have a collaborative two-way street going on. So that research was born out of the pandemic. So, we every summer I would go to Honduras in the summer, and we would do this very fun in-person intensive training summer camp. And there was a practicum where, kids would come to school and we would have this like microcosm of a school environment simulated. I mean, it was a very COVID unfriendly situation, it turned out. Back at that time, we had no idea it was coming. So we had to do the training online in the hopes that we would all be back in school in the fall as normal. Of course, that didn't end up happening, but the training got put online anyway. And so I was interested to see, all right, this seems to be something that's happening, this might be happening globally more often now, is online programs. And so what can we learn from this experience? So we had them designing the tasks and doing digital reflections on their task design process. And we basically collaborated with pretty much like a global range of mentor teachers in our network who were calling in from really all over the world, from Europe, from North America, from South America, from Central America. And we partnered them up with our novice teachers so that they could get feedback and support on their experience going through the training, what they were learning, and what they were planning on developing for their classrooms in the fall. So, we learned a lot from that collaborative experience. And I think one of my biggest takeaways was reaching out to a network like that and leveraging mentorship so that people can get lots of modeling and reflective time seemed to be really effective in building connection, even though we were all separated at that point. And, even though they've gone back to in-person teaching now and the training can happen again in person, the nice thing is that we have this entire module that we've put online that now teachers that are absent because of, medical reasons, or they can't come for some reason or they're late to training. Now we have a repository of all of these of all this information, all the TBLT videos and how-to guides that we made. And so they're able to use that as a resource now for ongoing professional development, which I think is helping solve this problem of we have such a short time to train people.
Yes.
Now we can actually offer more ongoing development so that people can keep striving towards the ideals that we've set out for ourselves.
That's really interesting. Just out of curiosity, was this course like an intensive course, or was it a drip feed course over a period of time?
So we modeled it after our in-person course. So it was, a specific time that it was in mostly asynchronous, so self-paced, that they had to work through modules. But then we had weekly, Zoom meetings, which honestly was insane because there were people literally all over the world. And I actually, at one point, I remember putting in one of those websites where it lets you calculate what the best meeting time would be for people in the different time zones. And it was like a red icon that was like, there's absolutely no time that's going to be convenient for everyone. Somebody's going to be up in the middle of the night or up very early in the morning. But anyway, so we would have these sessions where we'd come together, and then everybody was connected with their mentors on WhatsApp. So people were texting or doing audio messages or calls on WhatsApp in the interim. And then they ended up building their own, we used Google Classroom, and they built their own Google Classroom sites to organize materials that they were developing for their class. And we gave them feedback on that in lieu of a true practicum.
That's brilliant. Brilliant. I think from my own experience, not only as a teacher educator, but as a teacher undertaking development, sometimes I think that the asynchronous courses that are done over a little bit more time, which there's resources there, but you still have that contact with the person that's going to help mediate the concepts and stuff for you. I think that can be really, really beneficial. And COVID was obviously a very terrible time for the world, but it did push education to look at a tool that's providing a lot to many teachers that couldn't access that before. So I think that's really, really interesting. And yeah, great work on the course. I'm
Yeah.
looking forward to reading the paper when it comes out.
Oh,
Um,
thanks.
uh, Now we'll get to books in a sec because I know that you have something coming out. But I want to have a look at the advice section. Now we've been speaking mainly about teacher education, so maybe we'll focus on teacher educators for this.
Hmm.
Um, let's say there are teacher educators out there in various contexts, and they're saying, okay, look, I'm convinced about the value of TBLT, and I want to bring it to the teachers in my context. What would be your top one or two pieces of advice for these teacher educators?
Yeah, well, I think one of the first, maybe most easy first steps that I would recommend is to seek out a community of like-minded educators and or researchers or people that bridge that gap. Things like we're doing today, which I hope can, be accessible to multiple people who wear multiple hats also, like we do. First of all, everything is more fun when it's shared. And
Yes.
also, there are just so many excellent resources out there. I think a lot of people think that they have to completely reinvent the wheel every time they do something. And while we want, TBLT ideally to be really contextualized, that doesn't mean that you can't rely on resources and adapt them for your teaching context. So, you have a variety of open access tasks that are available on IRIS, research repository. Laura Grzinski Weiss over at Indiana has her task bank.
Mm.
We have research article summaries now on Oasis, which are really great if you want to just do a one pager that reviews some recent research that's happened. You can look for TBLT on there. And then you can look to see what's going to be possible in your own teaching context from there and work from there. So I have a study. This is another gossip kind of thing, ongoing research where we're looking at how teachers take pre-existing tasks, talk about their needs of their context that they're teaching in, take a task and then adapt it for that
Mm.
context. And
Okay.
so we're looking at, using Think Aloud, and we have an eye tracker about where are people focusing their energy, what changes are they making, how are they going through that process, with the hope that we can make recommendations for training programs so that teachers can go through this a little bit more easily of seeing,
Yeah.
okay, maybe I can adapt this for my learners' needs or for my language or for my context. So I think that this idea that we can adapt, we can build off what other people have done. We just need a community that works towards that, like as a united goal, is really, I think, where the way forward is here. So that'd be my advice.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. This sounds like a fascinating study. And yes, again, I look forward to I look forward
I'll
to
let you
doing
know.
that. Yeah, I didn't actually know about Oasis and the one page summary, so I'll have to check that out.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of research out there. So it'd be interesting to see what the summaries are. Obviously, you have abstracts, but the abstracts they like give you like that taste, but they don't give you all the good stuff. So yeah, it'd be
Right. Yeah, check out Oasis. So there are a couple journals that are mandating that published articles now have to make an Oasis summary, and
okay, cool.
it's supposed to be targeted at an easy reading level, and it has the methodology, the analysis, and the results all in one page. Oh, your dog's here, or
No,
oh
this
oh
is actually a cat that we've that my girlfriend
oh
has rescued. Yeah.
oh
Um.
hi,
So
a big cat lover.
she's a bit sick at the moment, but yeah,
Oh,
she's doing
so
okay. She's in here
cute.
with me, so she's gonna stay here for the moment. Um.
Love it, love it.
Well, that's really interesting. Yes, I think the one page summaries are actually really good
Yeah.
for if for anything else, just for bridging this research gap. Teachers don't have time to read articles, and sometimes articles are really difficult to read.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Even for
S-
me, I will say.
so speaking about reading,
Yes.
um, we get to my favorite section of Sponge Chats. Sorry, I'm playing with the cat here because she's falling. She can't hold herself up. Um,
Oh,
the book recommendations. Now,
yes.
perhaps this is a moment where we can plug your, I believe, upcoming book,
Yes.
um, The Art and Science of Language Teaching. Can you tell us a little bit about this?
Yes. Thank you. I was gonna wait till the end to plug. I didn't want to plug my book first, but I'm happy to do it now. And your cat appearing in the chat is actually auspicious because my co-author Allison Mackey on that book, she's also a cat lover, and the book is pitched to language teachers and language educators. So it's written in a style that could just be used immediately, hopefully, in a language teacher training program or in a reading group
Brilliant.
circle. And we have, a lot of whimsical illustrations that are illustrating some of our concepts, and we feature cats heavily in them because we're cat lovers. And, we wanted the book to feel fun, not just heavy reading like we were just mentioning some research articles can be. So the way that we've designed is we actually surveyed language teachers from all over the world about what are your top questions about language learning, and we compiled them into a list of 21 questions. So each chapter is a question, like how do I what's the best practices for correcting my students in the classroom. And then we asked all these teachers to give us little stories. So we have each chapter opening with a little vignette about one teacher and what happened and what they were struggling with. And those are all based in real stories. And then we have a short section on the research, what the research says. And then really importantly, we have a section on what the research does not say, because I think there's this idea sometimes that, we have all the answers. And a lot of times we just don't. We have some suggestions, we have general ideas, but teachers need to know where they really should rely on their own knowledge
Yeah.
of their students and their own best judgment for what is right. So we have a section in each chapter what the research doesn't say, and then the rest of the chapter is all ideas for tips and activities and things that you could implement that match these principles in your language classroom. So it's very practical, it's really fun. And it's something that I'm hoping we can, have conversations around. And, we were just inspired by, I sometimes get emails from people that say, oh, can I read this, I heard about Dornier's research on motivation, and I wasn't sure I was completely understanding it. Do you have other recommendations for readings? And sometimes I go and I look and, I can only find these very heavy research articles with
Yeah.
really advanced statistics in them. And I think, oh, this is just not right. So I'm hoping that I'll be able to share these chapters with teachers in my community or other teachers, just so that they can get a taste of some of these areas in a really accessible way.
Brilliant. And do we have a date?
Yes, it should be at the end of this year. So it's in production. It's my first book, so I really don't
Yay,
know.
congrats.
Thanks. Um, so I'm fingers crossed. Allison and I are very motivated to get it out fast. So we'll see. Hopefully we can move it along as quickly as possible. But I'm hopefully by the end of this year.
Brilliant. Well, I look forward to getting it and reviewing it. I do a lot of reviews on my blog as well, so I'm looking forward to doing that.
We'll make sure you get a copy.
Yeah. Oh, brilliant. Thank you. And thinking, I suppose not just your books, but other books
Yeah.
that people interested in task-based language teaching might benefit from digging into.
Yeah, so I just recently read and reviewed a really great one that was by Rosemary Earlem and Constanza Tolosa, which is the pedagogical realities of implementing task-based language teaching.
Okay.
So that was great because they follow teachers. So obviously that was why my interest was piqued
Mm.
around the design and evaluation of tasks, and then later how they implement them. And this was in the New Zealand context. And I, in particular, appreciated that it really had this spirit of bridging the divide between researchers and practitioners.
Mm.
So it's a great example of TBLT implementation with beginners too. So there are examples with
Brilliant.
younger learners or with beginner learners.
Mm.
So it's relatable, I think, for practitioners who, might recognize themselves in some of the quotes and experiences that are about the teachers. But it's also really interesting, for researchers, who maybe haven't been in the classroom with younger beginner learners in a while, and they can see like the reality of what
Yeah.
these people are facing. And maybe they can hopefully feature these kinds of populations more prominently in future research. So I really appreciated how it looked at both sides of that issue. And I thought it was really inspiring from a research standpoint as well.
Very interesting. I hadn't actually heard of that one. So, is that by the who's the publisher on that? Do you know?
That's John Benjamin's, I
John
think.
Benjamin's, yeah. They have a
Yeah.
brilliant TBLT series that I'm too poor to buy everything, but I I have read some of them, and they have a lot there. They have like a whole dedicated TBLT series, which is brilliant.
Yes. Yes, they
So
do. Yep.
I do
Yep.
need to
This is
read more
John
of them.
Benjamin's.
Yeah.
This is in their task-based language teaching series. And it came out last year. So it's pretty new. So
Yeah.
don't beat yourself up if you haven't seen it yet, but I definitely would recommend that if you're interested in this issue. Um, and then the other book that I wanted to mention from if you are looking at more of the research side of things is my colleague Allison Mackey. She published a book with Cambridge recently, Interaction, Feedback, and Task Research in Second Language Learning, Methods
Mm.
and Design. So those that know Allison's work know that she is an expert in research methodology, among many things. And this book really focuses on tasks and how can, stimulated recall for tasks and how can task research be featured more prominently. So I think from a research side, that's a really great book that people could look at for advice in designing research studies.
Brilliant. Okay, well, it's interesting because normally I have the same books that get recommended, but these two actually haven't been recommended for, so I'm very excited to put them on the list. I also have a very long list of books that I need to read now, so
Yes.
it
Yeah.
never ends, never ends.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, I
well,
had some more common ones on there, Mike Long and Amadean's recent edited volume. I have a chapter in that has the case studies. So that Cambridge Handbook of TBLT
yeah,
obviously is a go-to, but I thought maybe you had other people recommending those kinds of books to you. So I tried to go for slightly different ones, even though of course there's so many to recommend. It's very
yeah,
hard to
yeah.
choose.
Well, actually, the Cambridge Handbook one hasn't been recommended, but I think it's only because
Oh,
it's relatively new. Like
yes.
it's still I think a year old, maybe a year and a half
Mhm.
old, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I haven't even dug into it yet. So, but I'm
Oh,
looking forward to getting into that.
good. It's
But
really good.
yeah, yeah. But it's also very expensive. So and that's also one of my complaints I think about
Mm,
with a lot of research. Like I'm doing my master, so I have a lot of access to things through the university, right? But I think a lot of teachers that are interested, they're kind of scared by, having to pay the 30 or 40 euro in at least in my context, 30 or 40 euro for the books. So I think that's a bit of the downside. But there is still a lot of free resources. There's loads of stuff out there now, and people are talking about it. And Sponge Chats here with us, we're
yes.
talking about it for free. So
Yeah.
so come listen.
Yeah. And reach out. Researchers are sometimes able to send you copies of their research studies. And that's totally normal and not weird. A lot of people maintain pages on, ResearchGate and other websites where they can upload open access versions of their articles. And so, don't hesitate to reach out is my advice to people who want to get access to research because we want people to read our work and we want it to be read by the people that matter. So I really hope that people, I hope that teachers know that we're as annoyed by paywalls as they are.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, definitely. Well, Lara, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you today.
Likewise.
And I think we've got a lot longer that we went over time by a lot. But that's fine. Who cares?
Who
Um,
cares?
but I look forward to hopefully seeing you again in the future and maybe to chatting again after I've read your book.
That'd be great. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Cheers, Lara. Bye.